I was fascinated by the awe-inspiring experiences of being inside historically significant buildings, which were not only visual marvels but also acoustic wonders. And I was curious to explore the emotional impact of such acoustic environments. Researchers mentioned that the acoustic environments in such spaces may have supported rituals through resonance, but there was not enough evidence to prove that claim. However, there is strong evidence that sound and music can elicit emotional impact. So what happens when the architectural features alter the sound characteristics? Can this alteration enhance the emotional impact of sound, and how? What are the acoustic characteristics of such sonic wonders? And how can we design spaces that create similar acoustic experiences without replicating the same design? I adopted aural architecture, which integrates the physical, perceptual, and cultural aspects of acoustics. Aural architecture suggests that the physical aspects that include sound propagation in spaces shape our perception of the acoustic environment, but this perception is also impacted by cultural aspects. To explore how these three aspects shape the acoustic experience and impact emotions, I divided the research into three phases. Phase 1 deals with the perceptual and cultural aspects and aims to examine the role of the acoustic environments in impacting emotions and the role of the cultural background in enhancing such impact using worship spaces as case studies. Phase 2 deals with the physical aspects with the aim of analyzing the acoustic parameters of the case studies and examining the interaction between the room and the sound source. And phase 3 connects all phases together by studying the correlation between the acoustic characteristics of the case studies and their emotional impact, with the goal of establishing a base for analyzing and designing spaces with supportive acoustic environments that enhance the occupant's experience. The three phases included field measurements, simulation, and virtual reality application, which I will explain in more details. For the perceptual aspects, this phase included psychological and physiological indicators of the emotional response. To study how the acoustic environments, which is a result of the space design, shapes the acoustic experience and impacts emotion. The main research question for this part included, first, does the acoustic environment enhance the emotional impact created by sound? Second, does the intensity of the emotional impact differ based on the characteristics of the acoustic environments created by the architectural design? And third, does the intensity of the emotional impact differ based on the cultural background and familiarity with the sound and acoustic environment? There was a need to recreate the experience orally and visually. So why the visuals were included? This research deals with architectural acoustics, with the interest of understanding the acoustic environments shaped by the architectural features. Researchers argue that the sound perception is linked to visual perception, and the conflict between what we hear and what we see can create a sense of discomfort. Since there are examples of contemporary worship spaces that neglect the acoustics in the design process or eliminate sound reflections and depend heavily on sound systems to create artificial reverberation, this research was aiming to illustrate the significance of considering the architectural elements and their role in the acoustic experience. So the goal was to study the acoustic experience with the presence of the visuals. And to ensure that the focus was on the acoustics, the questions asked to the participants were related to the acoustics, as I will show later in the questionnaire. The study included 4 religious buildings in Detroit with historical and social significance to the community. To study the cultural aspect, the research included 2 types of religious buildings, 2 mosques, which I called A1 and A2, and 2 churches, B1 and B2. The audio was captured using the binaural recording technology, which creates a 3D sensation of being in the actual space. And the visuals were captured by a 360 degrees camera. Then a VR headset was used to play back the scenes. For each building, there were two scenes. One that included a dry recording, meaning that it does not include the sound reflections in the building, and another one with the wet recording captured inside the building. And the visuals were the same in both scenes. And the same process was repeated with each building. The recordings included Islamic recitation, and Christian hymn.
Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me.
And this video shows an example of one of the scenes with the wet recording and the 360 degrees visuals. The other scenes can be found using these QR codes. And here's a snapshot of each one. The study included 20 participants with diverse cultural backgrounds. After each playback, the participants answered questions that include describing their experience with a focus on the acoustics, reporting the intensity of the emotional impact, selecting keywords of the emotion that describe their experience, and reporting their familiarity with the religious recording and with the acoustics of similar worship spaces. In addition to collecting physiological signals that included heart rate and skin conductance using a wristband during each scene. The data were analyzed using mixed methods. The quantitative part included statistical analysis, and the qualitative part included thematic analysis. The results showed that the wet recordings were reported for high intensity of the emotional impact. And if we take a look at the rating delta of dry and wet recording for each building, we can see that the majority of the participants reported higher emotional intensity for the wet recordings. Also, if we compare the ratings for the wet recordings of each building, we can see that the range of the difference in the rating was more significant with the wet recordings than the difference in the rating with the dry recordings. This example explains it further. The average rating in these two cases was very close with the dry recording, while it was more significant with the wet recording, which confirms the control of the visuals in the study. The familiarity with the religious recording was varied among the participants. And in general, the familiarity with the recordings and similar acoustic environments were associated with reported intensity of the emotional impact. If we take a look at the keyword analysis, we can see that more positive emotions appeared with the wet recordings. And the sacred emotion showed the most significant difference between dry and wet recordings. If we compare the number of times the word spiritual was reported in each building, we notice that it was reported for the largest number of times with A1. The result is consistent with the rating of the reported emotional intensity of the buildings, as A1 was also rated the highest. The results of the physiological signals also showed significant difference between the dry and wet recordings for each building. This is an example of the skin conductance response of one of the participants, and we can see that the response is higher with the wet recordings. In addition, the results showed particular cases that worth investigating in terms of the relationship between familiarity and the physiological response. For example, we can see that the heart rate response followed the same pattern, but the response was higher with the wet recording. This can be explained by assuming that the pattern is a result of the emotional impact of the characteristics of the sound content, such as the musical characteristics, and the level difference represents the additional intensity added through sound reflections in the wet recording. The thematic analysis allowed for a deeper understanding of the participants' experience. The analysis resulted in 3 themes: acoustics, perception, and emotions. If we take a look at emotions, we can see that the words related to the spiritual emotions appeared with the wet recording. After studying how the acoustic environment influences the human experience and impact emotions, the question is, what are the acoustic parameters that contribute to that impact? And how does the room interact with the sound source? So phase 2 deals with the physical aspects of acoustics. Since resonance was mentioned multiple times in the literature describing the acoustics of some historic and even ancient structures, I decided to study room modes, which are the resonances that result from generating a sound in a room. Inspired by Alvin Lucier's famous piece, I Am Sitting in a Room, where the composer records his voice, plays it back into the room, and re-records the playback multiple times until the frequencies within his voice that correspond to the resonances of the room are amplified and transformed into ringings of room modes. This research proposes a method named multiple convolution, in which the impulse response that captures the room's acoustic features is convolved with a dry recording. Then the process is repeated.
الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين
I created a simulation model to test the method and the way it allows for studying the interaction between the room and the sound source while taking into account the sound source type, room geometry, and materials. To study the impact of geometry, the convolution was generated using the impulse responses of a base case room and a similar room with different ceiling geometry. Looking at the spectra, which shows the sound level for each frequency, we can see that the level of the convolved sound in blue is higher than the dry recording in orange, and the level of the convolved sound in the base case is higher than the modified room. We can also see the peaks that represent the room modes in each room. When the convolution is repeated multiple times, we can see the room modes become more distinguishable, especially at low frequencies. We can also start to see that not only the sound level of the convolution is higher in the base case room than the modified room, but also the level of amplification was non-uniform across different frequency bands. It was higher at low and mid frequencies than high frequencies. When we try another sound source, we can see that the peaks and the amplifications are now different than the ones we saw using the previous sound source, based on the interaction between the sound source and the room. When we change the room materials and make it highly absorptive, we can see that the sound level has decreased. So unlike the traditional room mode calculators, this method allows to calculate room modes considering the room geometry and materials, in addition to the interaction between the room and the sound source. Thus, it allows to identify which frequency band will be amplified by the room with complicated geometry, such as worship spaces. I applied the method to a case study, the Deannet Center of America in Maryland, after collecting the impulse responses at different locations in the field. We can see that the modes at high frequencies were more sensitive to location, which can be seen in the fourth column of the multiple convolutions. The convolution also allowed to identify the frequency band amplified by the room. When we include the time domain and look at the spectrogram of the impulse response, we can see that the room amplifies the dominant frequencies of the sound source. If we zoom by taking a short time segment and compare the dry and wet recording, we can see how the room alters the sound level at different frequency bands and extends it in time. This emphasizes the importance of using convolution or auralization to analyze the interaction between the room and the sound source. So how does the acoustic parameter contribute to this impact? If we take a look at the values of the acoustic parameters such as early decay time in the 4 buildings used in phase 1, we can see that the values vary more at low frequencies. The same for reverberation time, clarity, and sound strength. In all previous parameters, the values in all buildings become close at 1000 Hz and vary more significantly at low frequencies. This indicates that only reporting the parameters at 1000 Hz, which is common, might cause overlooking important acoustic features that can contribute to the impact of the sound perception and emotions. Finally, I wanted to study the correlation between the acoustic parameters and the emotion indicators from phase 1 to establish further methods for evaluating the acoustic experience and guidelines for designing spaces that enhance the occupant's experience. The result of the correlation analysis showed that low frequencies were critical, especially with sound strength G. This again confirms that reporting acoustic parameters only at mid-frequencies may result in missing critical information related to the subjective evaluation of an acoustic environment, and more specifically related to the emotional impact. If we compare the result with previous research in concert halls, we can see that the correlation with G was not limited to low frequencies. A possible explanation for this is that unlike vocal chanting, musical instruments cover a wider range of frequencies. All the results so far show that the significance of low frequencies. So I decided to go deeper in investigating the possible connection between low frequencies and the emotional impact by analyzing the bass richness through calculating the bass ratio and bass gain. As you can see, A1 showed the highest bass ratio and the highest bass gain. A1 also was the building that received the highest rating for spiritual emotions. Bass gain focuses on sound strength at low frequencies. So low frequencies continue to show up as critical band. So what's special about the amplification of such frequency band? Researchers reported sound amplification at low frequencies in worship spaces known for their unique acoustic qualities, such as the Hagia Sophia, and explained that this non-uniform amplification in some cases reinforces the vocalization with strong resonance at 125 Hz by 25 decibels, such as in Chester Cathedral in England. And similarly, in ancient structures which researchers suggest were used for rituals, strong resonances around 100 Hz have been reported. So I decided to study resonance quality and width to see if this applies to the case studies. I calculated resonance width, which is the distance between the occurring resonances in frequency. The buildings showed different resonance widths at low frequencies, especially at 125 Hz, with A1 being the lowest. And I also calculated resonance quality, which is the ratio of the resonator's center frequency to its bandwidth. And the results showed that A1 has the largest value at 125 Hz. I wanted to dive deeper and see if there are any strong resonances at 125 Hz, similar to the ones reported in the historic examples. So I analyzed the frequency domain of the impulse responses of the 4 case studies. And I saw 2 strong individual modes between 120 and 200 Hz in A1. A1 also had the highest magnitude at low frequencies. To study the interaction between the room and the sound source by examining whether the room amplifies the dominant frequencies of the sound source, I selected A1 and A2 for further analysis because I used the same religious recording in both. Looking at the spectra of A1 and A2 at the top, we can see that A1 has more dense modes between 100 and 800 Hz, which was explained by having low resonance width in comparison to A2. If we look at the spectrograms at the bottom, we can see that those frequencies lasted longer in A1, while they died faster in A2. Now let's take a look at the spectrogram of the dry recording. We can see that the highest magnitude is between 100 and 800 Hz. And if we study the interaction between the room and the sound source through the spectrograms of the wet recordings of A1 and A2, using the same dry recording, we see that A1 emphasized the dominant range of the dry recordings more than high frequencies, which may explain why A1 was rated higher in terms of the emotional impact. So the main conclusion of this research is that the acoustic environments have a significant impact on the occupant's experience and emotions, and this impact is linked to low frequencies in worship spaces. So how do we apply the results to other buildings? If we go back to the DCA building as an application and generate a convolution or oralization, we notice that the DCA emphasized the dominant frequency band in the sound source even more. If we compare the resonance widths of DCA and A1, which was rated high for the emotional impact, we can see that they follow the same pattern and that the DCA have smaller resonance width at low frequencies, meaning that it has higher resonance and dense modes at the same frequency band. Based on that, we may predict that it can enhance the emotional impact, although further research will allow to examine if there is a limit after which the increase in resonance quality at low frequencies is not effective any further. This research established a method for evaluating the aural aspects of spaces. It included studying how the sound can enhance the occupant's experience, connects the experience with the cultural background, and lays the foundation for future research on sound characteristics of emotionally supportive environments. It has also developed a method for analyzing room modes and resonances of spaces with complex geometries, a method that can be used as a tool to inform design decisions of modifying existing rooms' surface materials depending on the acoustic amplification needed across frequency bands. Such analyses allow for identifying the design features that enhance the auditory experience by reinforcing the desired frequency band and opening new possibilities for creativity in designing spaces that enhance emotions and well-being. And this is where further research is needed. To do that, we need to analyze the contribution of the architectural surfaces in reinforcing the desired frequency band. This visualization was generated based on the field measurements in the DCA, using the acoustic camera, which utilizes beamforming technology. So this is generated from field measurements and not simulation. If we compare between the sound level once the sound is generated and after it was reflected by the architectural surfaces, we can clearly see how the space amplified low frequencies significantly. This video shows the buildup that resulted in amplification in low frequencies after multiple reflections. So what's the role of each architectural element in that amplification? This could be investigated further through a parametric analysis with the goal of establishing guidelines for designing supportive acoustic environments with restorative qualities that can enhance well-being. Instead of copying worship spaces known for their successful acoustics, this will give architects the freedom to be creative in their design while achieving acoustic environments that support the spiritual experience. Beyond that, another direction for future research is multisensory experiences through virtual environments. In places such as museums, for more realistic representations of the intangible cultural heritage of acoustic environments. And in video games, through the consideration of the match between the visual and aural aspects and the resulted emotional impact that enhances the experience.